July 1942. The desert shimmered like molten glass beneath the Egyptian sun. Dust curled around the boots of weary soldiers as the wind whispered across the dunes, the only sound between the crackle of distant gunfire and the hum of flies over burnt-out trucks. For 2 years, this unforgiving landscape had become the stage for a contest of will between two empires, two visions of order, and two generals who would come to embody them. At first, it was chaos. Britain's proud Eighth Army, stretched thin and undersupplied, had stumbled backwards across Libya and into Egypt. Rommel, the German desert fox, seemed unstoppable. His tanks swept through the dunes with mechanical grace, his movements unpredictable, his confidence absolute. His legend grew with each victory, whispered even among his enemies, that he was not merely a commander, but a force of nature. But nature is cruel, and the desert, more than any general, decided who would survive. British soldiers learned to fight not only the enemy, but the heat, the thirst, the unending glare. Sand invaded every ration tin, every weapon, every wound. Water was rationed more carefully than ammunition. Engines seized, tempers flared, and discipline frayed under the white-hot sun. Yet in those small acts of endurance, a shared sip of water, a quiet joke in a slit trench, Britain's battered army began to discover something stronger than tactics: defiance. By the spring of 1942, the North African campaign had become a grim rhythm of advance and retreat. From Tobruk to Gazala, Allied units fought bravely, only to be flanked again and again by Rommel's uncanny maneuvers. British commanders, constrained by London's politics and Cairo's fear, struggled to match his daring. Each defeat felt heavier than the last, not just in lives lost, but in faith eroded. Newspapers back home spoke of the desert fox with a mixture of awe and dread, as though the war in Africa were already lost. Rommel himself was no mere propagandist's invention. Charismatic, fearless, and deeply respected by his men, he drove through the front lines to see the battle for himself. Soldiers remembered his small figure standing atop an open staff car, binoculars in hand, the sun glinting off his goggles. He believed in leading by example, not by distance, and in those years, his instinct seemed infallible. Yet even brilliance has boundaries. Behind the glamour of his victories lay a brittle truth. The Afrika Korps was always short of fuel, always waiting for supplies that never came. In Berlin, Hitler's attention was fixed on the vast war in Russia, and North Africa became a sideshow in the grand design. Italian convoys were sunk by the Royal Navy, and the Luftwaffe could no longer protect them. Rommel fought not only the British, but starvation and scarcity. Still, his attacks continued, driven by momentum, by pride, and perhaps by the belief that one final strike could break the British for good. That strike would come on the very doorstep of Egypt, at a small railway halt called El Alamein. The men of the Eighth Army knew the name before they ever saw it. Alamein was the last defensible line before the Nile Delta. Beyond it lay Alexandria, the Suez Canal, and the heart of Britain's empire. If Rommel reached it, the Mediterranean might fall, and with it, the hope of holding the Middle East. Cairo streets filled with rumors of evacuation plans, of a new Dunkirk. Churchill himself called it a grave hour. And yet, in the midst of fear, something in the British character hardened. In the desert camps east of Alamein, soldiers began to dig trenches, gun pits, and faith. They fortified their positions, not because they were told to, but because they had nowhere left to go. Letters from home spoke of rationing and air raids, families enduring their own kind of siege. For many men, the front line became more than a battlefield. It was a mirror of national endurance. One officer later wrote that they fought not for ground, but for meaning. In the long twilight of those July evenings, as the horizon glowed with fire and dust, British gunners watched the desert turn red with sunset and tracer fire. The enemy was out there, somewhere beyond the mirage, gathering for another push. And yet, beneath exhaustion, something had shifted. They had stopped running. They had begun to believe that even in defeat, there was dignity. Rommel's advance slowed. His tanks, low on fuel, crawled rather than charged. His soldiers were hungry, their machines coughing dust and smoke. The desert fox had reached the limit of his chase. The British, cornered yet unbroken, now faced him with a quiet resolve he had not seen before. Between them stretched the vast silence of the western desert, the crucible in which the fate of empires would be decided. In London, Churchill sensed the turning of the tide before the maps showed it. Before Alamein, he would later write, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. But that was still months away. For now, the men waited in the dunes, eyes fixed on the horizon, wondering what kind of leader could take this weary army and turn it into a weapon of hope. Perhaps that was Britain's truest strength, not in the perfection of its plans, but in the endurance of its spirit. The desert had stripped away illusion, leaving only courage and necessity. And from that dust, as the chapter closed, a new kind of leader was about to rise. The air above Cairo hung heavy with dust and anxiety. Reports from the front spoke of exhaustion, of units too demoralized to fight another day. In the officers' mess, rumors whispered of yet another change in command, another desperate reshuffle to halt the unhaltable. And then, into this atmosphere of resignation, arrived a man whose very presence seemed to defy it. Bernard Montgomery, small in stature, precise in movement, and possessed of an almost unsettling calm. Montgomery was no stranger to adversity. He had been shot through the chest in the First World War and left for dead on a Belgian battlefield. That experience had etched in him a singular clarity, the knowledge that survival is never an accident. His discipline was not arrogance but armor, an outward form of inner conviction. When he stepped off the plane in Cairo, wearing his black beret with its twin badges of rank, he looked less like a savior than a schoolmaster. Yet, behind those sharp eyes lay the promise of order in a world slipping towards chaos. He arrived to find an army without belief. The 8th Army, a patchwork of British, Australian, Indian, South African, and New Zealand units, was exhausted, mistrustful, and fractured. Its commanders had changed so often that loyalty had become fragile. Many soldiers no longer believed victory was possible. They dug, they waited, they endured. What they lacked was faith, not in their country, but in themselves. Montgomery understood this before he issued a single order. His first words to his senior officers were not about tanks or tactics, but spirit. I want first to win the confidence of my army, he said. Without that, we go nowhere. In the desert heat, he set about transforming not only the army's organization, but its identity. Gone were the days of improvisation and confusion. Montgomery's command posts were models of precision, maps perfectly aligned, orders clear, logistics disciplined to the minute. He demanded professionalism from everyone, from the cooks to the corps commanders. Yet beneath the strictness was a rare psychological insight. He made each man feel that the coming battle, however distant, would be won by his contribution. The mechanics who tuned engines, the signalers who laid cables. Each task became part of something larger, something deliberate. He toured the front constantly, standing on armored cars, addressing groups of soldiers in the open desert. His speeches were short, clipped, and utterly confident. There will be no retreat, he declared. We will stand and fight here. For an army accustomed to uncertainty, the words landed like a revelation. It was not bluster. It was certainly delivered as commandment. Slowly, the atmosphere changed. Where once men had muttered of evacuation, now they spoke of victory as a matter of time. In Cairo, the politicians noticed it too. Churchill, ever the reader of morale, sensed in Montgomery a kindred spirit, a man who could turn rhetoric into reality. He is the kind of general who wins battles, the Prime Minister said. But Montgomery's confidence was not for Churchill's benefit. It was for the men who would soon risk everything under his orders. He believed that morale was a weapon sharper than any bayonet, and that a soldier who believed in his commander could withstand what others could not. Behind the lines, Montgomery's reorganization took shape. He demanded that supply routes be fixed, ammunition stocks secured, and fuel reserves multiplied. Gone were the improvisations that had plagued earlier campaigns. Every detail mattered, because in his mind, the chaos of logistics was the root of battlefield defeat. He told his staff, if we are to beat the Germans, we must first outthink them. And outthinking to Montgomery meant out-preparing. The men noticed the difference almost at once. Their rations improved, their pay was on time, their equipment arrived in full. The 8th Army began to move, not as a desperate mob, but as a single organism. Training intensified. Units rehearsed maneuvers by moonlight. Artillery batteries practiced coordination until precision became instinct. To some officers, Montgomery seemed obsessed with detail. To others, he seemed to see the whole war at once. But beyond the drills and discipline lay something subtler, a moral reawakening. Montgomery spoke of purpose, of duty beyond survival. To soldiers who had seen friends fall and victories crumble, he offered not comfort, but meaning. One sergeant later wrote, "We didn't just follow orders. We followed our beliefs." That transformation, slow and invisible, was perhaps his greatest victory before a shot was even fired. Meanwhile, Rommel, far to the west, was gathering his strength once more. Reports filtered through that the Desert Fox, though weary and ill, was preparing another offensive. His reconnaissance planes flew low over the British lines, his tanks shifting beneath camouflage nets like predators ready to pounce. Montgomery read the intelligence calmly. He did not rush to strike first. Instead, he smiled and said, "Let him come. He will break himself on us." That confidence would soon be tested in the most decisive confrontation of the Desert War. But for now, in the stillness before the storm, the 8th Army had found its heartbeat again. Under the relentless Egyptian sun, a once-defeated force stood tall, its spirit rekindled by a general who understood that war was as much a battle of minds as of machines. Perhaps leadership, in the end, is not the power to command, but the courage to believe. Even when others cannot, Montgomery had given his army that belief, and as the horizon flickered with the heat of another approaching battle, Rommel's empire of momentum refused to rest. Across the sun-seared frontier of Egypt, the wind carried the rumble of engines and the promise of triumph. Dust plumes marked the advance of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, the spearhead of an army that had done the impossible again and again. Their commander, recently wounded and still weakened by illness, led from the front, his field car slicing through the dunes with the assurance of a man who had come to believe that willpower could outpace reality itself. Rommel's genius was movement. He understood that in the desert, to stay still was to die. His forces struck not where the enemy stood strongest, but where they least expected. His attacks were not lines but spirals, feints, withdrawals, sudden encirclements. British officers, trained in the geometry of European battlefields, struggled to comprehend it. To them, he was a phantom, appearing at dawn where logic said he could not be. To his men, he was almost mythic, the general who shared their hardships, who drove into the gunfire, who seemed incapable of defeat. And yet, even as his reputation soared, the cracks beneath it deepened. His army was running on fumes, literally. The Afrika Korps fuel convoys from Italy were being annihilated by British submarines and aircraft. Each liter of petrol that reached the front was a victory in itself. Ammunition was rationed. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks. The desert, with its endless horizon, magnified both his genius and his vulnerability. Still, Rommel pushed on. His attack on the Alamein line was meant to be swift and decisive, a strike before the British could recover. He hoped to sweep past their flanks, take Alexandria, and open the road to the Suez Canal. To Berlin, he sent messages of confidence. To his officers, he gave orders that bordered on impossible. The heat was punishing, the dust suffocating, and the British resistance, though thin, was stiffening. Rommel's men advanced anyway, driven as much by loyalty as by exhaustion. His command style was unlike any other in the German army. He trusted his instincts more than his maps, his eyes more than his staff. He would climb from his vehicle to study the enemy through binoculars, noting every glint of metal, every trace of movement. It was this immediacy that made him great and doomed him. For every mile he gained, his supply lines stretched thinner, his communications faltered, and the enemy's intelligence grew sharper. What had begun as a war of speed was turning into a war of attrition. And Rommel, despite his brilliance, was now on the weaker side of that equation. In London, British analysts studied his patterns with almost scientific fascination. They admired his daring, even envied his freedom. But they also recognized its cost. Rommel is a gambler, one intelligence officer noted. And gamblers eventually lose not through folly, but through mathematics. The numbers no longer favored him. For every tank he repaired, Britain shipped 2 more from its factories. For every soldier he inspired, hunger stole another's strength. By September, Rommel's health was deteriorating. He was often feverish, reliant on injections to keep him upright. His aides begged him to rest, but he refused. "The army will not fight without me," he told them. And he was right. His presence was their morale. When he appeared at the front lines, dust-caked, binoculars in hand, the weary soldiers found enough faith to hold on another day. But his enemies too were watching. A new commander, Montgomery, had taken charge, and unlike those before him, he refused to be drawn into Rommel's rhythm. He would not chase him across the desert. He would make Rommel come to him. The two men had never met, yet their rivalry was almost intimate. Each studied the other's methods, anticipating moves like chess masters on opposite sides of an invisible board. For Rommel, this new British general was an enigma, deliberate, unhurried, methodical, the kind of opponent who unnerved him most. He was accustomed to exploiting hesitation, but Montgomery offered none. By October, the Africa Corps was stretched to breaking point. Supplies trickled through at less than a quarter of what was needed. The Italian divisions beside them were exhausted, their tanks obsolete. Even the German panzers, once symbols of unstoppable might, now sputtered from lack of oil. Rommel's command reports grew sharper in tone, his frustration bleeding through. He warned Berlin that without fuel and reinforcements, disaster loomed. The response from Hitler was typical: stand fast, no retreat. The words were iron, but the reality was sand slipping between fingers. And yet, Rommel fought on. In the dying light of each day, he drove out to the observation posts, scanning the horizon where Montgomery's forces were massing. The British artillery guns glinted like rows of teeth beneath the sun. He sensed that a storm was coming, one unlike any before. His staff urged caution, but Rommel was a man of momentum. His entire career had been built on defying probability. To halt now would be to betray himself. In that defiance lay both his greatness and his undoing. The legend of the Desert Fox had been born in speed and surprise, but the desert had changed. The British no longer scattered at his approach. They were digging in, building strength, waiting. And what had once been his open highway was turning into a trap. As night fell over the dunes, the glow of burning fuel dumps flickered on the horizon. The Africa Corps, once a symbol of invincibility, was running on willpower alone. And, in Cairo, Montgomery prepared his defenses with quiet precision. The stage was set, not for another chase across the sands, but for a reckoning. Brilliance had carried Rommel far. But in the desert, even brilliance has boundaries. As his army strained towards the Nile, he was about to meet an enemy whose weapon was not speed, but resolve. The wind swept eastward from the Libyan frontier, carrying with it the dust of 2 long years of retreat, along a thin stretch of desert between the Mediterranean Sea and the vast impassable Qattara Depression. The British Eighth Army took its stand. Here geography became destiny. There was no room to outflank, no space to retreat. It was the narrow gate through which the fate of North Africa, and perhaps the wider war, would pass. Montgomery saw it with a clarity others did not. The place was more than a map coordinate. It was a crucible. He declared that the line at El Alamein would hold, not because it must, but because it would. His tone was absolute, and his soldiers believed him, because belief itself had become part of his strategy. He understood what few commanders dared to, that war is not only fought with tanks and shells, but with conviction. From the moment he arrived, Montgomery transformed the line into both fortress and symbol. Every position was surveyed, every unit given a precise role. Minefields were laid in vast belts of steel and sand, artillery calibrated to ranges measured down to the yard. Behind the trenches, repair depots multiplied, supply chains thickened, hospitals were built. It was organization on a biblical scale, not glamorous but relentless. He called it tidying up, as though preparing a house for a storm. Yet beneath that understatement lay a profound psychological truth. Order itself breeds courage. To the men of the Eighth Army, the difference was palpable. For the first time in months, there was a sense of control. Their general did not promise miracles, only methods. "There will be no withdrawal," he told them. "If anyone starts talking about retreat, shoot him." It was delivered with half a smile, but the message was unmistakable. Under Montgomery, defeatism was forbidden not by regulation, but by faith. The soldiers began to speak of him not as a commander, but as a presence, exacting, unbending, quietly reassuring. Daily life at Alamein became a rhythm of labor and resolve. The roar of bulldozers, the clang of shovels, the endless digging into the unforgiving earth. Men worked by moonlight to conceal their movements from the Luftwaffe. The desert air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and fear restrained by duty. Montgomery's visits to the front were brief, but unforgettable. He would stand beside a gun crew, hands clasped behind his back, inspecting the horizon, and say in his clipped voice, "You'll stop them here, won't you?" It was never a question. But even as confidence grew, so too did the weight of expectation. The men knew Rommel was still out there, patient, clever, waiting for his moment. His reconnaissance planes prowled the skies, and at dusk, his artillery probed the British lines like fingers testing a wall for weakness. The strain of anticipation was immense. One wrong move, one collapse in morale, and the entire defense could unravel. Montgomery's genius lay in managing not just the battlefield, but the mind. He rotated units carefully, ensuring rest without weakening readiness. He encouraged chaplains and entertainment units to move among the men. Football matches were played in the desert dust. A strange normality settled in, the calm before the storm. The Alamein line itself was an engineering feat. Nearly 5,000 anti-tank guns were dug in, 500,000 mines sown beneath the sand, their positions mapped with ruthless precision. Behind them, tanks waited under camouflage nets, silent and still. The Royal Air Force prepared its bases along the Nile, ready to strike the moment the battle began. Every man, from private to general, knew that this was the final stand. There would be no more retreating to the Nile, no evacuation, no escape. Montgomery's greatest weapon, however, was invisible. He had turned morale into an artillery of the mind. Each soldier believed he was part of a vast design, that his small act, a trench dug, a mine laid, was essential to a victory already destined. In letters home, the tone shifted from doubt to defiance. "We will win this one," wrote one sergeant to his wife. "This general of ours doesn't know how to lose." By early October, the transformation was complete. The 8th Army, once broken and unsure, now moved with the unity of a single heartbeat. Patrols ventured into no man's land, testing Rommel's lines, capturing prisoners who spoke of dwindling supplies and falling morale. The balance had begun to tip. Montgomery waited, unhurried, methodical. Every night he studied reports by the light of a single lamp, planning the moment to strike. He refused to be rushed, not by Churchill, not by the desert, not even by history. When asked later what he was thinking in those weeks, one of his aides recalled, "He was calm, like a man watching the tide come in." It was the calm of someone who had prepared for every variable but one, the human spirit, which he now commanded with quiet authority. As the sun set on the eve of battle, the desert fell silent. Thousands of men lay awake in their trenches, staring at the stars. The air was still, charged with something unspoken, not fear, but anticipation. Somewhere in the darkness, Rommel's men waited too, weary and underfed, but still dangerous. The two armies faced each other across a narrow belt of sand and wire, unaware that within days, one of them would be broken forever. And then, as midnight approached, the stillness cracked. The sky erupted with light and thunder. Artillery shells tore across the night, and the desert, quiet for so long, roared to life. The desert night exploded in light. At precisely 9:40 p.m., more than 1,000 British guns opened fire in perfect unison, their thunder rolling across the dunes like the voice of some ancient god. For 20 minutes, the earth itself seemed to shake. Men could not hear their own thoughts. Shells screamed overhead, turning the horizon into a chain of fire. From Cairo to Alexandria, the distant glow was visible, the first act in a drama that would decide the fate of the Middle East. When the guns fell silent, the infantry rose. Columns of men, dark shapes against a red-lit sky, began to move forward through the smoke. Ahead lay Rommel's defenses. Barbed wire, minefields, anti-tank ditches, a labyrinth of death that stretched for miles. They called it the Devil's Gardens. Each mine had been laid by German and Italian engineers with meticulous care. And now British sappers, crawling on hands and knees, began to clear them by hand, probing the sand with bayonets under fire. Every click of metal against the casing was a heartbeat between life and annihilation. Rommel was not present at the start of the battle. Ill and exhausted, he had been recalled to Germany for rest. His absence left his army without its guiding instinct, and yet his defenses bore his signature, layered, deceptive, hard to break. The first British waves met resistance within minutes. Machine guns cut through the darkness, tracer fire whipping across the desert floor. Communication lines faltered as radios jammed and cables were severed by shell fire. For hours, confusion reigned. But Montgomery had planned for chaos. His strategy was not speed, but attrition, a slow, grinding pressure designed to break Rommel's army piece by piece. He called it Operation Lightfoot, because each infantryman would step lightly through the minefields, while tanks would follow only when paths were cleared. Progress was measured not in miles but in yards. Commanders reported gains of 50, sometimes 100 yards, before being pinned down again. It was not the kind of battle that inspired glory, but the kind that defined endurance. In the front lines, the desert became a furnace. The air was thick with cordite and dust, the smell of burnt rubber and oil, the cries of wounded men carried by the wind. Medics worked by the light of burning vehicles. One soldier later recalled, "You couldn't tell where the horizon was, only flashes, and the sound of men shouting in languages you couldn't understand." Yet within that chaos, a strange rhythm emerged, the rhythm of persistence. Behind the front, signalers hunched over wireless sets, straining to hear orders through static. Dispatch riders raced through shellfire to deliver handwritten messages when the lines went dead. Engineers worked by moonlight to repair tanks, using scavenged parts from wrecks. Pilots from the Royal Air Force roared overhead, strafing enemy positions, guiding the artillery by radio. Every arm of the army was bound together in one relentless purpose. Not brilliance, but endurance. By the third day, the Eighth Army had driven a wedge into the Axis line. Rommel, hurriedly recalled from Germany, arrived at his headquarters to find his once proud army already buckling. He ordered counterattacks, sending his panzers surging forward through the smoke, but they met British anti-tank guns hidden behind minefields. The desert became a graveyard of steel. The Africa Corps, which had once swept across continents, now fought for inches. Montgomery watched the battle unfold from his caravan command post, calm, methodical, unmoved by pressure. Reports flowed in. He adjusted, reinforced, persisted. He did not seek a dramatic breakthrough. He sought inevitability. Every order, every movement, every pause was part of a design meant to drain Rommel's strength faster than his own. By the end of the first week, the lines were scarred, but unbroken. The British had advanced perhaps 6 miles. To the untrained eye, it looked like a stalemate. But inside those 6 miles, the balance of power had shifted. The Axis divisions were bleeding supplies. Their tanks were half empty, their men half starved. The Luftwaffe's presence had faded, replaced by constant RAF bombardment. The scales were tilting, slowly but irreversibly. Then, on the night of November the 2nd, Montgomery unleashed his final blow. Operation Supercharge. Once again, the sky erupted in fire. The New Zealand and Highland divisions led the assault, supported by hundreds of tanks. They moved like a living wall through the shattered German line. Rommel's army, weakened beyond endurance, could not hold. His reports to Berlin were terse, despairing. "Our strength is exhausted," he wrote. "The enemy is overwhelming." At dawn, British patrols found abandoned positions, enemy vehicles still running with no crews inside. The Africa Corps was in retreat. For the first time, the Desert Fox had been outlasted. His brilliance, his daring, his instinct, none of it could overcome the simple arithmetic of endurance. Montgomery's patience had proved the sharper weapon. The victory at El Alamein was not a miracle of genius, but of unity. Every man, from the generals to the cooks who loaded ammunition, had been part of the same machine. For the British soldier, who had known only retreat since 1940, it was redemption. In the words of one veteran, "We had stopped running. At last, we were the hunters." Churchill's telegram to Montgomery was brief but jubilant. "You have won a victory that is not only magnificent, but decisive." Yet even he knew, and Montgomery understood most of all, that victory came with a price. The desert was littered with the wreckage of men and machines, the silent testimony of endurance. As the smoke cleared, the morning sun rose over a landscape of ruin. The air was still, the guns at last quiet. The Eighth Army had prevailed, but at a cost written in blood and exhaustion. The Empire had found its strength again, but also its burden. Perhaps that was the paradox of El Alamein. That triumph, when it came, felt less like glory and more like survival. And, as the victors buried their dead beneath the sands, the question remained, what in the end had it truly cost to win? The desert that had once echoed with the roar of engines now lay silent, broken only by the whisper of wind over burned-out tanks. The great battle was over. The sand dunes around El Alamein were strewn with the remnants of 2 armies, twisted metal, torn uniforms, the spent shells of 1,000 guns. The smell of cordite lingered in the still air, mingling with the faint sweetness of death. Rommel's once proud Afrika Korps was retreating westward, shattered but unbroken in spirit. The soldiers still called him Der Wüstenfuchs, the Desert Fox, but now the name carried sorrow as much as awe. His legend, once defined by victory, was beginning to take on the hue of tragedy. For the first time in 2 years, Rommel faced not an enemy he could outthink, but an order he could not obey. From Berlin came the command, "Stand fast! Fight to the last man." It was pure Hitler, defiant, detached, and utterly disconnected from reality. The Führer demanded sacrifice. Rommel understood futility. He looked at the map spread across his command car and saw only truth. Fuel exhausted, ammunition gone, men starving. His army could no longer fight. It could only die. And so, for the first time in his career, he defied a direct order. He ordered a retreat. Not cowardice, but compassion. His decision would save tens of thousands of lives. For that act, he became something new. Not the infallible general of propaganda, but a man. His legend shifted from one of brilliance to one of conscience. In private letters, Rommel wrote of the futility of a war driven by ideology rather than honor. A soldier's duty, he reflected, is to fight for his country, not to destroy it. His words would later echo across generations. She's a quiet rebellion against fanaticism in an age that worshipped it. The retreat was slow and brutal. British and Commonwealth forces pressed relentlessly, harrying the broken Axis columns through Libya. The desert, once Rommel's ally, now turned against him. Vehicles sank in soft sand. Fuel trucks were abandoned and set ablaze. Those too wounded to move were left behind. Yet even in defeat, Rommel refused to allow cruelty. He forbade scorched earth tactics, ordered that prisoners be treated well, and ensured civilians were spared where possible. His war had always been one of soldiers, not ideologues. At the same time, Montgomery, now the victor of Alamein, felt the peculiar solitude that comes after triumph. In his caravan, surrounded by the quiet machinery of command, he wrote brief notes of thanks to his subordinates and longer letters to his family, restrained, factual, devoid of pride. The victory had been total, yet he sensed its weight. He had carried an army from despair to dominance, but at the cost of thousands of lives. For every flag raised, a grave was dug. Montgomery's leadership had always been rooted in discipline and moral clarity. Yet now, as he watched Rommel retreat across the desert, he felt no elation, only respect. He once said privately, "Rommel was a gallant and able opponent." It was not flattery, but acknowledgement. In another time, on another field, they might have understood each other perfectly. Both were men who demanded precision, who valued morale above machinery, and who saw war as a matter of mind as much as matter. Their parallel journeys converged not in battle, but in their humanity. Rommel, once the instrument of conquest, became the conscience of a doomed campaign. Montgomery, once the architect of victory, became its custodian. Both knew that glory fades faster than grief. As the Afrika Korps fell back toward Tunisia, the German High Command sought scapegoats. Berlin's broadcasts spoke of temporary reverses, but the soldiers on the ground knew the truth. The myth of invincibility had died at Alamein, and, in its place, emerged something quieter, the dignity of survival. For Rommel, the months that followed would bring further bitterness. Illness forced him to leave North Africa before the final collapse. As he boarded the aircraft that would carry him back to Europe, he looked once more over the endless sand, the theater of his greatest triumphs and his greatest defeat. He had entered the desert as a symbol of German mastery, and left it as a man who had glimpsed the limits of obedience. For Montgomery, there was no celebration, only movement. Orders came swiftly, to pursue, to advance, to keep the pressure unbroken. The British press hailed him as the savior of Egypt, the man who had turned the tide. But in the long nights between campaigns, he walked among the field hospitals, speaking quietly with the wounded. He had learned what all great commanders eventually must, that victory and loss are brothers, not opposites. The war in North Africa was drawing to its end, but its moral aftershocks were only beginning. In the ashes of defeat and the calm of triumph, two men stood on opposite sides of the same truth, that even in total war, honor could still flicker like a flame in the wind. Perhaps that was the final legacy of El Alamein. Not just the restoration of hope for Britain, but the redemption of humanity amid the ruin of empires. The desert had tested both men and found them not perfect, but human. The war would move on, to Sicily, to Italy, to Normandy, but the lessons of Alamein would travel with it. For Montgomery, a burden of responsibility. For Rommel, a reckoning with conscience. The Desert War had ended, but its echoes were only beginning to reach home. December 1942, the guns fell silent over El Alamein, and for the first time in years, the British Empire exhaled. The battle that had begun in darkness ended in sunlight, a hard, clean light that revealed the scale of both ruin and redemption. Across the scarred desert, the wreckage of Rommel's retreat and Montgomery's advance lay intertwined, the debris of two visions of war that had tested the soul of the 20th century. El Alamein became more than a battlefield victory. It was a turning point in the moral weather of the war. For Britain, it proved that courage, organized, disciplined, and sustained, could rewrite the story of decline. For Germany, it exposed the cost of blind obedience and the limits of even the most brilliant command. Between these two truths lay the future of Europe. In London, Churchill stood before the House of Commons and uttered words that would outlive the war itself. Now this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. It was a phrase heavy with both triumph and humility, an acknowledgement that victory at Alamein had not concluded the struggle but transformed its spirit. The age of despair had passed. A new conviction had taken its place, that the tide could be turned, that tyranny could be met and overcome. The transformation was not only military, but moral. In the months that followed, British soldiers marched through Libya and into Tunisia with a steadier step. They carried with them the lesson of the desert, that endurance, not arrogance, was the foundation of victory. The Eighth Army, once broken and scattered, had become a symbol of national renewal. In Cairo, ordinary Egyptians watched convoys rumble westward and understood, perhaps for the first time, that Hitler's reach could be checked. For Rommel, the legacy was different, but no less profound. Recalled to Europe, he carried within him the quiet burden of disillusionment. The man who had once been Hitler's favorite general had begun to see the abyss beneath the surface of victory. In private correspondence, he spoke of his respect for Montgomery and his growing contempt for the Nazi hierarchy that demanded sacrifice without honor. In time, that moral fracture would lead him to a fateful choice, one that would cost him his life. But the seeds of that defiance were planted here, in the sands of Egypt, when he chose humanity over fanaticism. Montgomery, too, was changed. The victory made him a national hero, but it also isolated him. He carried himself with the precision of a man who knew that history would judge not only what he had won, but how he had won it. Unlike the flamboyant generals of old, he spoke little of glory. His pride lay not in conquest, but in control, in having restored to Britain's soldiers their belief in themselves. Yet he knew, perhaps more than anyone, that the price of that faith was written in names carved into desert graves. In the years after the war, historians would debate El Alamein's strategic value, whether it was the turning point of the Second World War, or simply one among many. But for those who lived it, the meaning was simpler and deeper. It was the moment when defeat stopped feeling inevitable. The victory did not end the darkness, but it proved that darkness could be fought. The desert itself kept its silence. The minefields were cleared, the wrecks rusted under the sun, and the wind slowly erased the tracks of men and machines. Yet even in erasure, memory remained. At the Commonwealth War Cemetery at El Alamein, row upon row of white headstones gleam against the sand. Among them stand inscriptions chosen by families from every corner of the empire. He died that others might live, at peace with his desert comrades. Words of quiet, enduring pride. In Germany, Rommel's name too endured, though shaded by tragedy. When he later turned against Hitler, joining those who sought to end the dictator's rule, it was not ambition that drove him, but conscience. His choice to take his own life rather than betray his men became a final act of integrity, the completion of a journey that had begun in the deserts of North Africa. Thus, two men who had faced each other across the sands became, in time, symbols of something larger than battle, of leadership tempered by restraint, of courage bound to conscience. They had fought not only for ground, but for the moral direction of their age. Montgomery's certainty and Rommel's humanity formed twin beacons in a century that so often lost its bearings. El Alamein, in that sense, was more than a victory. It was a mirror, reflecting both the light and shadow of human resolve. The discipline that saved Britain, the compassion that redeemed Rommel, the endurance that defined an entire generation, all were born here, under the same unrelenting sun. And so, in the silence after the guns, history was left to ask a final question. One that echoes still through every age of conflict. What kind of victory truly endures?